Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's expert panel discussion. Thank you all for joining. I am Candace Smith, the Marketing Manager for Events and Brand Experiences with BARR Advisory. We are delighted today to be joined by thought leaders in the security and compliance space. And during our time together, we're going to delve into the relationship between these three organizations charged with building a world of trust in a complex landscape like cybersecurity. So the panelists will explore how successful collaboration between automation partners like Vanta, auditors such as BARR Advisory, and MSPs from the viewpoint of Electric, how they can come together and overcome common pain points and achieve unparalleled success on the journey to compliance. Our experts will share some success stories from the field, discuss key responsibilities and accountability, as well as the culture of fear. So I will have the panelists introduce themselves in just a moment, but to get things started, I have a few housekeeping items. So first of all, we will address any questions during an audience Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please remain on mute during the webinar, and you can submit your questions through the chat and the Q&A feature, and we will address those at the end. Also, a recording of the webinar will be provided, and we will send that out via email. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists for some introductions. And we'll get started with Brad Thies from BARR Advisory. Brad?
Yeah, thanks. I'm the founder and CEO of BARR Advisory. We are the audit perspective on this call.
Wonderful. And so also we have Sam with Vanta.
Hello, everybody. Great to be here. My name is Sam. I am the Director of Auditor Partnerships at Vanta. So I represent the software and the automation platform that is Vanta today.
And finally, we have Aaron with Electric.
Hi, everyone. Aaron Shierlaw. I'm the CISO for Electric AI. We are a MSP.
Great. Well, thank you all for taking the time to have this conversation with us today, and let's go ahead and get started. So I'd like to start off this conversation with getting your unique perspectives on the role each of your companies play in this type of partnership dynamic. With three separate organizations coming together to support the security and compliance of a single customer, like a three legs on a stool, what supporting role is being played? And Brad, I'm going to kick it to you first from the auditing perspective.
Yeah, thanks. So a while ago, I was sitting in a room with a client, and along with their MSP, who was managing a portion of their IT environment, I brought up a really fairly common issue where a really powerful account had access to an entire database of millions of dollars worth of their crown jewels of the organization that we really couldn't determine accountability for. We ended up looking at the logs, and there's a lot of suspicious activity, and it really couldn't be traced by to a really real person, a business process or a reason. In other words, there was a lot of people that shared this account because they had full access to lots of dollars worth of data. And so what I was hoping to do in this conversation was have a discussion about some ways to put some countermeasures in place. It was a fairly innocuous discussion. It wasn't a gotcha type thing or anything. So I was hoping to have a really open, honest conversation, or at least so I hoped. And as soon as I brought up the issue, hoping to move into that countermeasure discussion, I saw the client turn his head to the MSP with almost these death eyes, and immediately the MSP representative went in full denial mode, full defense mode. And it turned that the client to go in full defense mode. And so after the meeting, I pulled the MSP aside. I had a great relationship with him and said, "What's going on?" And it turns out that their company was incentivized by the client to have zero audit findings. And so we couldn't even get to that discussion of really what's going on. How can we protect this data? And I call this the ostrich effect. This is, if you know what an ostrich does when they sense danger, it buries its head in the sand. And the idea is that an ostrich can just hide from the threat and the danger will eventually pass. And long story short, we met again and we got everything out on the table. They put some countermeasures in place. So crisis averted. But the thing that was interesting about this, coincidentally enough, is that when we looked at their logs, they had this Syrian IP address that had the activity. And we had there was a news event that happened a few weeks later from that an organization through this attacker group coming through this Syrian IP address stole a bunch of HR records, and a whole entire database of HR files got compromised, and they routed a whole payroll to their bank accounts that they set up in fake identity names. So from my perspective, I went to my boss after that and I said, and I'll never forget what he said. And he said, you can delegate everything but accountability. And so from my perspective, crisis averted there. But it just shows you how that's an extreme example, but there's a lot of nuances and subtleties that happen, between MSP, us as the auditor, as well as an automation solution of really determining who's responsible for what, and making sure we're bringing the real issues to the table so we can solve. So that's my that's my perspective. Sam or Aaron, you guys want to take yours?
Love it. That's a great story, Brad. Thanks for that. It sounds super interesting. Yeah, I think from my standpoint, really quick, what Vanta's role is in this case for the three parties we have here represented, with the MSP, with an auditor, and with a platform or software solution like Vanta. What Vanta does is we're sort of the glue that connects the three parties of the customer that's going through security maturity program and building, or going through an audit and compliance function. And so what Vanta helps do is it does a really good job helping customers upstream from audit, getting ready and getting their ducks in a row for potentially going through an audit. And that readiness work is where our MSP partnership network really can help and step in and work with our customers in a whole slew of different ways, whether that's like deploying the Vanta software itself, or like setting up controls, operating those controls across the whole IT security landscape. And then also what Vanta then does really well is actually take that same customer through an audit and getting them certified into a compliant manner. And that's where we connect them with the auditor side, the auditor partner network, like Brad here and his company. And so we end up with customers that have we have joint customers with an MSP or multiple MSPs working with them upstream from audit, operating controls, all that stuff. And the auditor as well, coming together, Vanta sort of bringing all of that together to make it really streamlined and efficient and effective. And so that's kind of the place we find ourselves, and bringing that network together in the best way for our customers. Aaron, I'll kick it over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I mean, representing the MSP here, it can be a challenging position. Brad, your story resonates a bit. As an MSP, we have a contractual relationship with the customer, not with the auditor, not with the audit partner. We are contractually obligated to meet the customer's needs. So definitely bringing a third-party audit in can be a challenge. They're auditing a lot of our work, right? They're looking at, are you offboarding users? That's usually, the work we're doing. So it definitely can put an MSP in a precarious position. Having a background in security and compliance, I definitely have a strong ethical guidelines on how I deal with that. And I would, I do what I can to coach our customers that ultimately, I think, Brad, you mentioned accountability. I ultimately coach our customers that they're still accountable for their systems, their platforms, the work that we're doing. We do it in as transparent of a way as possible to avoid any of those kind of situations, like you mentioned, where the customer's incentivizing the MSP to sweep whatever they need to under the rug to just get through that audit, right? That's not really valuable to anybody involved. So I would definitely tell the MSPs and the customers out there, make sure you have a transparent relationship, and be closely aligned when that audit happens. So you're not in a kind of a three-way battle. You're more, like we talked about, three legs of a stool. You're all working together to better security, better compliance, learn and grow and move things forward. Candace, I'm going to send it over to you. I think we have some questions we're going to go through.
Yep, indeed. I was trying to find my unmute button.
No worries.
All right. So now that we've covered how you separately support the security and compliance journey, let's get into how the compliance auditing MSP relationship or collaboration, if you will, how they work to create the most successful experience for a joint customer. And Sam, I'm going to have you start this one.
Sure, yeah. And Aaron, I think what you just said is a great segue into this question about working together as a three-legged stool approach to it's the better together story for our customers, where we do have joint interests for the customer, the MSP representing the customer in some capacity here, as a service provider for them. But to Brad's point, ultimately that accountability is still on the customer, and that's super important here. And making sure that's really clear with the customer, and that's driven at the policy level and the engagements that are set up with the MSP and the customer, but making sure that is clearly communicated and understood, so that when that same customer goes through an audit, that contention that Brad alluded to in his story, and Aaron, that you've experienced, really shouldn't be there. That collaborative approach, that communication having been taking place beforehand, going in, and that understanding the accountability and where it lies, should really set up the experience for the customer in the best way, and to drive the best results as a result of that. So I think that collaboration, that communication side of it, and understanding where the accountability is, it's still with the customer. They still own those controls. They still are responsible for the results of the audit. And another thing too, and I think we might get into this more later, but like, audit findings are not bad. I mean, that's a misnomer. It's good that you're finding things, and that's a mindset that some customers don't have. But the spirit of continual improvement, you're going through these audits to get better. So you should find stuff.
And we will definitely get into
We'll
that.
get more into it. Sorry.
Yeah, that's I mean, adding on to that, I think paradoxically, when you don't have things that you can measure or don't have transparency, things do look really good because you don't have any findings. And I think that's the value that we see with this three-legged stool, if you will, of when a compliance automation tooling like Vanta comes on board, you start to get everybody on the same page, because that's becomes part of the system of record, where that's the program, and we can all speak in terms of those languages that those issues are surfacing, and there's bound to be issues. That's a lot of times you turn on the tool for the first time and it's just everything's red, and you gotta work through that through a partnership with. It's not always just black and white if these controls are real, these issues are real issues or not. It's through collaboration with the MSP perspective, what the tool is seeing, making sure it's pulling in the right data and how you calibrate that, and then having that auditor perspective as well, from, hey, this is what we see on how you would eventually get the report and the opinion at the end of the day. But I really like the fact of having a good system of record, because education is really hard sometimes when you're not working with anything, of just having a system of record where everybody can go into and say, okay, yeah, that's where the stuff lives, of the evidence that you need, as well as how our security posture is looking. And then it helps us to get beyond just the basic blocking and tackling of compliance into some of those more value added, ever evolving things that you just always have to continue to improve the maturity of your cybersecurity program, in conjunction with this three-legged stool that we're talking about today.
Yeah, that's great. So the question was around relationship collaboration to get the most of the experience. I think, one of the very kind of tactical things I would say here is if you're going through an audit and you have an MSP, you definitely need to sit down and prep for the audit. You need to sit down with your MSP prior to the audit starting and talk through any difficult areas, talk through scope of responsibilities. At Electric, as an MSP, we don't manage every single thing for our customers. And depending on each customer, the relationships are somewhat different. We may manage on-prem networks, we may not. They may have systems that are wholly out of scope for our management, an AWS environment, let's say. So I think the biggest thing I would at least say in this question would be sit down and prep for the audit, understand the scope. If you're the MSP, set that meeting up yourself. If you're the customer, set that meeting up. I see this fail when there's a lack of communication and it ends up in finger pointing. Brad brought up a great situation that wasn't driven by this root cause, but I've seen it before where there isn't good communication or collaboration prior to, and you get into those audit meetings, and it's like, well, I thought you, and that's just not a conversation you want to have, especially in front of an auditor.
Mm-hmm. Aaron, I'd be curious of your take on this, because this can happen where sometimes compliance is just like, I just want this thing to go away, which is fair. That's what I would want too as a customer. I want it to go away. I don't want to worry about it. To that point though, to what you were mentioning earlier about coaching the client through, setting expectations, how do you make sure that those roles and responsibilities are clear when everybody's coming together between an MSP, the customer, the client, and the automation tool, to make sure that it's everything's just not fine because you've hired an MSP, or everything's not just fine because you've got an automation tool. How do you really set those expectations? And through what you mentioned, just kind of pulling off that coaching aspect that I loved you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I think I always look at security and compliance as a governance function of IT. So it can get convoluted. In my head, it can get convoluted when you like outsource your work to an MSP and you're like, oh, you're doing all of it, security, compliance, and IT. Well, you're now asking a company to govern and manage the work you're asking the company to do. So that's where I would tell the customers and coach the MSPs to like make sure the customer put them in the authoritative seat. It's their job to be that governance function. It's their job to poke holes in the work you're doing. Help them do that, right? Bring them reports, help them poke holes in things you're working on. And setting scope, I think it's just a matter of talking through broad areas like I did. Endpoint, what are we doing for our desktops? User access, what are we doing on the user side? Infrastructure, and just kind of work through each of the kind of larger areas to understand, hey, is the MSP, if you're the customer, is the MSP doing proactive patching of our network infrastructure? Is it in the contract? I mean, I've seen a lot. We've done a few acquisitions, so I've seen very different, contracts between MSPs and customers. So I couldn't tell you exactly where to have it, but definitely have some clear written roles and responsibilities and scope in that relationship, whether it's in an MSA or even just a less formal email communication where you clarify, what's being done and not done.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to just add really quick that Brad, you mentioned something that resonated, which is security and compliance is really, it's never going to be plug and play where it just goes away and you hire an MSP, you buy a platform or software and it just takes care of itself. There's still a human aspect, a human component, requires communication and getting together, sitting down and going through the details. The devil's in the details, as they say, and that's still true today, no matter what you do. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that.
Yep.
All right. Well, perfect. I want to move on a little bit to getting into some success stories here. And so can you share any past success stories, or in contrast, have you experienced anything that hasn't worked well in the past? And let's see, Brad, do you want to kick us off here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I mentioned the story about, what didn't go well. I mean, other things that we've seen that haven't gone well is that, what Aaron was alluding to about just assuming the MSP was doing something, or assuming a tool is doing something. So like what hasn't gone well, it's usually, a lot of times change management. It's like we were doing an audit and we were asking for some change management records, and I said just talk to the MSP, and they didn't do any documentation. I mean, because that was in their policies, they didn't have any requirement to document anything. So that's what doesn't go well. But what we've seen that really goes well is, and I just want to continue to emphasize, Aaron, what you mentioned earlier about coaching customers through things, is there's the Vanta and the compliance automation tools really, to me, just shine light on where you got to focus your time and attention to. And the more you really just, get into those issues and then say, to Aaron's point, okay, what's the perspective on how to correct some of these things? Maybe they're not really that big of a deal, and then translate that into real risk within the environment. Because Vanta has tools that allow and unlock a company to kind of workflow through their different issues and findings, but it's not the ultimate accountability from the decision maker. It ultimately has to be the customer in partnership with the MSP and the auditor to make the decision on what's a real threat versus not, what can be kind of turned off for the time being, maybe followed up later. And then the other piece of it is then scoping as well. And so from an asset inventory standpoint, sometimes when I talk about a compliance automation tool shining a light on things, it can't shine the light if you don't tell it where to point to. And so if you don't connect some of your tools and systems to it, or maybe it can't, then that's an area of risk that is worth just exploring a little bit more on defining those roles and responsibilities. So we've found a lot of success when the MSP puts more of their coaching hat on and making sure that you understand the capabilities of the tool and what it's designed to do versus not, and then always have that partnership with the auditor of feel free to bounce ideas off of us because we're here to help as well. When you're going through that readiness, getting that perspective on what's going to be an issue versus not, and helping really advise on walking through some of those risk points.
Yeah, I would point out two things. If you haven't done an audit before, definitely do a prep, dry run through. Get an audit partner, have them do. My words are failing me, but there's before you do your SOC 2 type 1, you can do a kind of
a readiness.
Readiness. There you go. You can do a compliance readiness. And do that and be honest. Have the MSP be honest. Be completely honest. Find all those issues. Find those gaps. Find those areas. And then the other one I would say that the ones I've seen successful, at least for us, have again been when the customer takes the ownership. It's the auditor talking to the customer with the MSP behind them or beside them to support them. The customer is answering the questions from the auditor, and when it gets deep into a technical thing that the MSP is handling, it's like, okay, hey, can you help me here? Help me understand how we do this or that process. I feel like that's the best approach. I don't want it to be taken the wrong way, but it's definitely a dance with an auditor. It's not a black and white thing. There's definitely a dance that occurs there. And based on who you are, you have a different approach and risk tolerance for handling that dance. I have one approach when I work with our auditors, and I want our customers to own that relationship because they may have a different approach. They may want to find more issues so they can get better. They may want to find less issues because they want a clean report. That's really up to them. So.
Yeah. When we ask at the beginning, the question always is who owns your cybersecurity program? And we've had many times where the client says, well, that's our MSP or that's our virtual CISO. And that's when we have a really honest conversation with the client that can work. I mean, that can work, but long term, that's like putting the ostrich in the head in the sand. It'll work short term, temporarily for maybe even a few years, but long term, even if there's not really a dedicated CISO inside the company, there's got to be very clear responsibility of who owns that cybersecurity program. So a lot of times when we sit on the vCISO side, we'll just set up a very clear 2-page document on ownership of the program and where that the MSP piece fits in and who really sits on just different areas of responsibility within the company. So then it's very clear of, hey, this is my area of responsibility, even though I'm delegating this to certain components of a vCISO, MSP, or whatever. You're really using them for expertise and capacity, not necessarily using them for full-on accountability.
Yeah, I could add a couple of points, actually doubling down on a few comments from both of you. Aaron, I really liked your point on audit readiness, making sure that the customer if they haven't gone through an audit, if they don't have a dedicated team to compliance or a GRC team and they're kind of new to the space. One great approach is leveraging the internal audit requirement, especially if you're doing ISO. We've got a great network of MSP partners who offer internal audits to our customers, and you can bring them in. It's a very low risk activity in terms of maintaining compliance, but it can be leveraged really, really well to prepare and understand what exactly you'll be taken through in an audit for your teams. So that's one thing I think is a great point. And then Brad, your point on setting up scope correctly, because that hits really well with Vanta as a system. We plug in a bunch of data sources. We're pulling in a bunch of information. We're running tests on them. If that scope isn't set up correctly to begin with, things are gonna go bad in the audit. When the auditor comes in, they're looking for stuff that's not in the tool. Where things go really well is if it's set up correctly and that Vanta is that source of truth, that system of record, and all parties are singing from the same song sheet and it's efficient and streamlined. The auditor's only seeing what they need to see too, which Vanta does a really good job of. They're not going to give them more than they need. There's no need to do that. Is a big part of it. Brad, you smile a little bit, but those are some good points I think that you guys made.
Awesome. All right. So I'd like to jump into specifically how, from the managed services perspective, with a common mindset, and you've said it before here, being that we're here to support but not own. So how does shared accountability and responsibility work as an MSP when working with multiple organizations? So Aaron, do you want to get us started off?
Sure. Yeah, so I've said it a few times. I think the point I would kind of focus on here is out of sight, out of mind, and also like an audit usually like on a yearly cadence, but it takes constant, consistent effort to stay compliant, right? That's Vanta's world of this constant compliance. Technology doesn't always work. It doesn't. We put in place technology and to patch systems, keep them patched. It doesn't work 100% of the time. 100% of the time it fails, or you know what I mean. Like 100% of the time it's not going to work. So you have to have a human taking a look, following up, fixing those things, and not once a year right before your audit. You have to do it consistently. So I feel like a tool like Vanta, a tool like the Electric platform, is a perfect example of how this can work out. These platforms give the customer and the MSP visibility to when things are failing. And again, I would say the accountability sits with the customer to be using that platform, checking in on it when things are failing, following up with the MSP to make sure those things are getting resolved, and creating some muscle memory and a cadence around that. And not just expecting, hey, the MSP is going to log in and just make sure it's all green all the time. Like that's not the role. The role is to support you. It's your role to check those lights are green, and when the lights are not green, check in with that team and making sure they're turning those lights back to green.
Yeah. I mean, not being on autopilot helps, and if there's one key factor to really focus in on when it comes to shared responsibility is when it comes to policies. And you mentioned about the governance. Those policies are what govern a program, and to a certain extent, it has to align to your culture as well. And so often, coming in from an outside perspective, I always really work to understand the client's culture significantly, because that influences a lot of things on how they behave and act when it comes to compliance or autonomy. And when it comes to those things first is that any tool is going to come with a preloaded set of policies. Even coming from the vCISO perspective, which we also have a perspective on, we've got our own, canned templates as well, and we leverage the Vanta platform for their templates. But we always go through them. It doesn't take that long. It maybe is an hour or two going through each policy and saying, okay. And the question always is, first off, take your compliance hat off. Is this something that really resonates with your culture that can be followed? Because if there's friction with that, then it's just a policy that's for the sake of having a policy. It's not really ingrained and embedded within your program. And the only person that knows that best is somebody inside the company. And so really, really working hard on that responsibility piece is making sure that whoever owns the program, which is inside the company, they read those policies to make sure that they resonate with others, including their existing processes.
Sam, do you have any additional perspective you'd like to add?
I think that culture point was just spot on, by the way, Brad. I think that's a really important factor in working together and having that shared accountability, responsibility, accurately defined, depicted. The policy levels, I totally agree. That governance layer, setting it up, the tones at the top, trickles down, that whole thing. And so I wanted to actually ask a question that kind of on the spot here, but Brad, have you had clients, or I guess Aaron too, but where the culture's, it's a situation where you just don't want to take them on? Like, I don't think we should take the customer.
Yeah.
That happens, I think.
Yeah. We do. There's and that's sometimes the rub with when there's friction, when you don't have values alignment, there's going to be friction regardless. There's only so much tooling you can put into place that brushes over that. But yeah, we will say no to clients when there's not a values alignment, and it usually comes down to those two questions that I asked. Who owns the program inside the company? And sometimes they say, oh, that's the Vanta is going to do that for us, or the MSP is going to do, or the VCS is going to do that for us. If I really asked them to, in lack of better words, I'll give you one more shot to answer that question. And then they come around once I start educating them on the importance of that. Because oftentimes they just don't know what they don't know. And so that's the first question that we really ask, and that's our litmus test. And the second question is then more around, when there's an issue, what are you going to do about it? Do you want to just comply, which it's a hard question to ask, and you can see it. A lot of times we just ask the question around, do you want a security roadmap? Or first, do you have one today? What's your cybersecurity roadmap where you're at? If they don't have one, would you want one? And truly, do you really want one to continuously improve? Because otherwise, they're really just, again, going to go in that ostrich analogy. They're just trying to check the box and move on. And that's certainly okay for a certain, customer segment and niche, but again, long term, they have to really want it. And that's part of our role to educate and the importance of it, and the coaching aspect of what can go wrong and what can go right as well. We have a client that we love to work with because they call me probably once a week, just, hey, I've got this idea that I want to run by you that we're doing. And we found so many issues with them in the first time in that readiness assessment, and they fixed maybe a quarter of them, and they put the rest of them on a roadmap. And it was awesome to see because they started chipping away at those things. Understand there's capacity constraints. There's only so much time in the day to do things and priorities. And so we get that, but they're chipping at the way over them. We've had a 5-year relationship with them. And it turns out some of these findings that we've had actually ended up unlocking big deals with them for huge enterprise clients. One just recently, the other day, they got a contract with a Fortune 50 company. It's a multi-million-dollar contract, and it was so frictionless because they set up their architecture in a way to anonymize a lot of the data that they are collecting, and it unlocked their ability to take these huge files they basically do workflow administration for like people going on maternity leave, and they have to have very sensitive data. They're connected to these third-party administrators, and they were constrained because they were going to all of a sudden download millions of records of all of the employee data sets within this enterprise company. And if they didn't, and they're a 20-person startup, and if they didn't kind of chip away at these things over time, that would have been a huge lift for them to do by the time that contract came to their table as a prospect. And That's what I mean by, do you want a roadmap? And if you don't, then maybe it's not, maybe this isn't the right, at least it doesn't align with us when we look at companies, but because we've seen the value that it can play if you really truly believe in it.
That's a great example.
Yeah, I think it's probably very similar to what you said, Brad, is, if we find a customer that has, misaligned expectation around, checking the box for the sake of compliance, yet they're in a, they're a DoD contractor or something. That's one example I've come across where, that's maybe not a customer we're going to take on, where they, they're in a highly regulated cybersecurity focused industry, yet they want to do the ostrich thing. They just want to pay someone, make it go away, and oh, by the way, like, that's too much, we can't pay that much. It's like there's a misalignment here on how this all works.
I think the other point, Sam, I may kind of segue into culture a little bit is also, I mean, there's a really good, it's called the culture quadrants around cybersecurity. I can send that a link later, but it's just got different quadrants. Some, like banking and finance would be in a very, you do this because, and then you've got kind of the startups mode that are very much more have an autonomy around the way they do things. And quote that I often use is one from Alexander Hamilton, and he mentioned that people often oppose a thing merely because they have no agency in planning it, or because it may have been planned by somebody that they dislike. And so when it comes to implementing programs, if their culture is such that they're not like a bank where it's just like, you got to do this or else, but it's a culture of, you need to have agency in doing things. You can't just push a bunch of compliance requirements down somebody and expect them to do it. That's where some of the dance comes into, really just figuring out, how does this resonate to you? How would you do it? How does it make sense to your culture and your organization? So that everybody does have agency into it, and it's not just a once a year thing that the auditor comes into and says, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that for the past year." If they had no agency into it, there's no surprise that maybe something didn't get done, because why would you want to do something that you're not sure of why you're doing it in the first place?
That's a good point. I want to link to that culture quadrant. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say, we'll definitely share that out in the follow-up email with the recording.
Yeah, I'll send it out to the chat right now if that's possible.
Yeah. And while Brad is doing that, and I can also help out, Sam, before we move on to the next question, talking about the culture of fear, I want to touch upon, I know we have Aaron's perspective with electric, but are there any other perspectives that you want to cover here? Because I know the MSP landscape is vast. And so do you want to talk a little bit about, the VCSO technical, the IT MSP versus MSSP perspectives?
I think we kind of briefly touched on this, so it's good to kind of come back to it. But the MSP space is vast. All the services that can be offered to a customer in that IT security operations, application security, network security, like all this stuff that it goes on, and up and down too, in terms of governance and high level like VCSO type roles, down to like, security operations, hands-on keyboard, operating controls, monitoring, real-time incident response. You've got this whole vast space, and so I think the point I want to make here is that the actual services being brought to the customer by the MSP is just an important factor here in terms of the dynamic of this three-legged stool, and how they'll be represented in an audit, and where that accountability does lie, and making sure that communication is still there. And I think that's kind of the point, is there's such a wide array of services in the MSP space that it's an important factor in bringing the parties together here in a collaborative way. If you've got folks in an MSP that are much more tactical, they might not be as comfortable in an audit, like speaking about their controls or have less experience doing that, or less comfortable representing the customer, the company in a capacity like that. And so taking that into account is important, and making sure, depending on where the MSP is in the org, like that they're prepared for speaking to an auditor and representing what they do, or should they do that or not. And so it's kind of a high level comment, but I think it's an important one, just given the vast array, and there's so many services that are out there that can be represented in an audit by the MSP. So I don't know if you guys want to add to that, but that was kind of
I think that's a very great point. There's a lot of options out there, and I think that's great because wherever there's a problem, there is somebody out there that can help. And as long as you're very clear on what the problem is you're trying to solve, and the use case for it, because otherwise you just start bringing in people, tooling, without really understanding exactly what the objectives and the context and the way that you expect them to work, and even some of the measurables that you're holding them accountable for. And so I think that's a really great thing that there's so many options out there, because it allows you to focus on your core business, as long as you've got a really good understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve, and you feel comfortable with collaborating with these partners to kind of align your strategic objectives to and how they fit into that tactical stuff.
I'll give one story on an example from my own experience, where we were running a FedRAMP audit for a customer, and we had an MSP managing all the access controls, like adding, provisioning and deprovisioning users to the FedRAMP environment, highly regulated, super strict controls around that. And so that, when it came time for the annual FedRAMP audit, that MSP we brought in to speak to those very tactical controls, their day-to-day activities. And right away we kind of knew, like, oh man, the team here, they're not comfortable in this setting. Like they don't really know what they can say or not say. They're being very hush and like close-chested and careful, and it's just totally understandable. But it's like, oh man, we really needed to like sit down with them beforehand and like do some of that readiness work and make sure we had folks in there that were comfortable and really understood what we were doing and what they could say or not say, that kind of stuff. So it's one example.
Yeah, that's the fun part for us from the auditor perspective. When during that readiness, it's like, okay, everybody, air all of your dirty laundry, put it all out on the table right now, and so you start to get some trust and comfort with each other, so that come time for the actual audit, it's not as scary, because it really shouldn't be. It's everybody just we're all trying to solve the same problem, which it comes to, if we're doing the right job, it's not just to go out and do the audit. We're here to establish trust in the ecosystem of everybody that really works into this. And so we're all trying to solve that problem. If we focus on that as the problem and less about the findings on the audit, then we're all in a better place. I've never, ever, I've done thousands of audits, and on the vCISO side, I've helped fill out many questionnaires, and I've never seen a deal get lost because of an audit finding. It's the beginning of a conversation, so that everybody can get on the same page with what's the risk involved. And so that's usually the fear, is that my job's at risk, I'm going to lose a deal, and I've never seen that.
Great point.
You guys are trying to get ahead of me with the culture of fear here.
Good segue.
So I'm gonna ask my question so you guys can continue your conversation here. So that we've seen a culture of fear emerge when it comes to auditing and compliance, like Brad said, the big scary auditors. So like such as fear of like even a minor exception. So what can we do to change that culture of fear? And Sam, I'm gonna let you pick it back up here.
All right. So for me, I kind of mentioned, I got ahead of myself earlier, but in the spirit of continual improvement, if you're going to bring in an auditor and you're going to have them look at your stuff, and you're paying them money for this, and they come away with nothing. They don't find anything. Everything looks great. You've just paid them a bunch of money and nothing changed from it, and you're not improving, I guess, from that standpoint. So it's a mindset shift of in my own background, my own experience. realizing you want to have findings. In fact, what I would do in my prior roles is I would actually help steer the auditor to findings sometimes. I need you to find this so that I can enact change in my organization. And you use it as a lever to actually help your organization improve. And so you should go into an audit expecting to have findings, is my take on it. It's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. You can shine a light on things that need to be looked at, need to be prioritized, that might otherwise be overlooked. There's a whole slew of reasons, that it can be a good thing. And to Brad's point, the downside of an audit finding is pretty small up until you get to like a qualified opinion or something. But that's like, you've got a totally like debunked system, an ISMS that's not working at all, but these findings that are, within a single control areas and things like that are important. And so it's, I think the culture side of this within an organization, understanding that, like, because what happens in an audit, especially as a company matures and is bigger, you're bringing in the control owners, the folks that are operating things for the org, to speak on behalf of those controls in front of an auditor. Their regular job is not going through an audit. And so it's not uncommon for those folks to have that fear. Like, I need to be perfect. I need to be very careful and have no findings for my process that I own and I control. Totally understandable. So, but really it's, finding a way to break through that and be like, it's actually okay. Like we, to have findings. So changing that mindset is important.
Yeah. Yeah. I here's a little, a secret from the audit perspective is that, and this comes around that we do care. We like to keep it simple, and we've got to be approachable from an auditor perspective. Otherwise, this secret's a little challenging to implement. But we typically have a bunch of findings that don't even make it on the audit report. They're around process improvement opportunities, and because we understand we're really trying to meet the client where they are and where they are in the journey, because we realize it's a journey, it's a continuous thing. And so it's really what we expect is that they're chipping away at those improvement opportunities every year. Or unless we've challenged, we ask for challenging us on them. Hey, if this isn't a big issue, let us know why. But it's when those recurring kind of things that don't make it on the audit report, that are kind of those process improvement opportunities that you just kind of don't do. You don't even think about year over year, and you don't see improvement on that. That's when we see that progress is being stopped, and that ends up, equating a bigger risk. And this is really true in any business or relationship, is that you have to get better at accepting uncomfortable truths as fast as possible. And so our role is uncovering those truths as fast as possible, and help communicating that in a way where you can take action on that without fear, because that's in the best vantage point for everybody long term. And so that's the secret here. We're going to shed some truth. We're not going to ding you for it every year in the actual audit report, but we do expect progress, because that's the culture is what really sets that you got to do the blocking and tackling the compliance stuff. But if you don't have that culture of continuous improvement, then at some point you're going to be behind.
Yeah, I'd say the one point I put on it, specific to SOC 2, I read a lot of SOC 2 reports, and I would say,
Aaron.
yeah, that's where all this gray hair is coming from. I'd say I see exceptions in 1 out of 3, maybe. And it doesn't bother me, right? Some people didn't do their training and awareness. Like, when you have 500 people and you got to chase down every single one of them, a few slip through the cracks. Somebody doesn't get offboarded from an application that's not a critical application within 48 hours. Like, that stuff happens. And I know as a security practitioner, that stuff happens a lot more than I see in those reports. But when I do see it in the report, to me, it's actually a good thing. Mm-hmm. I look at that and go, oh, the customer was probably being honest with the auditor, or the auditor was doing a really good job of finding issues. I want to see a few of those. When I see the clean ones, it's like, okay, like, they danced the dance and got through it really cleanly. It doesn't give me the level of the same level. So I honestly actually like to see a few of those small findings. It helps me know that the quality was there.
Yep.
Awesome. So we've got one more question before we go into Q&A. And so from this collective's experience, what are some of the most critical cybersecurity considerations that organizations often overlook in the pursuit of compliance? And I think, Brad, why don't you jump in here?
Well, we've already talked about the accountability and ownership, so I won't beat that dead horse anymore. But if assuming you have clear ownership inside the company, then it comes down to how you manage your IT assets. Scope is very important, and just having a good visibility of where your attack surfaces might be, and knowing who owns those as well is really critical. Because if you don't know what you're trying to protect, then how are you going to protect them? And so you gotta start defining that what, and that's the beginning of any program, is just knowing where your assets are.
Yeah, and to tie into that, I see challenges moving things forward and gaining progress because there's a feeling like everything has to be perfect. Okay, with all these endpoints, we got to put endpoint controls on all of them. Or we have all these user accounts all over the place, and we got to get MFA on all of them.
Yeah.
So along with that asset inventory, I would say prioritize what you're doing. Find the key, find the administrator accounts, find the databases that have the critical data. Focus on getting those controls on the critical things. Don't get lost trying to fix every problem everywhere. Prioritize what you have.
Oh, yeah. It's music to my ears. I mean, when you see, we will provide a list of like 20 things that you got to do, but it always comes with, here's the top one that you should be looking at for the next quarter. Forget the rest, because if you have 20 things you got in the next quarter, none of them will get done, guaranteed.
I love that because it ties into like that risk-based approach that you hear about a lot, but it's somewhat hard to put in place at organizations, because risk is a bit of a nebulous thing. But to take that approach and apply your time and money in terms of security and compliance at the highest risk area. So really understanding your risk landscape is important, and it's kind of difficult. I think risk management in general is a bit of a art more than a science a lot of times, which good, bad, or otherwise. But that's an important like top of the jigsaw, kind of understanding your organization, where it fits, where the risks are, and then like focusing on those, chipping away at those higher risk areas first before trying to make everything perfect. That's never the goal. You're not going to be perfect, ever.
That's right.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for this insightful and pertinent conversation and discussion we've had. I'd like to spend the last few minutes of this call going over any questions that we have from the audience. So if anyone in the audience hasn't submitted a question in the Q&A, now would be the time to do so. If you want to raise your hand, and I can take you off mute and you can ask your question live. I know we already have a question in the Q&A, and so I will get that for you guys. So do you foresee the opportunity for more direct relationships or partnerships between MSPs and audit firms to kind of have MSPs be that driving conversation or be involved more in the conversation?
Yes. Yes, I do. Start with that.
I'd be interested, Aaron, your perspective on a more direct relationship with auditors.
I don't know. That's a challenging question, because there is a legal contractual relationship between an MSP and the customer. Creating another one with an audit firm, I don't know how that would work. I think, yeah, it's a good question. It's definitely a challenging question. Again, I look at this like there's the governance piece, and then there's the execution piece. And then the audit is like the third-party validation of both of those things. So I'm sure there's an opportunity, and it would be a very interesting conversation with an attorney to figure out how you would get the language in that agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it depends upon the role. And I mean, there's so many different types of MSPs out there. There's MSSPs as well. And so I think the short answer is yes. But like, to Aaron's point, sometimes the role really doesn't fit that piece, especially with what you're, contractually obligated to do and what you're asked of from the client. But where I have had direct relationships with an MSP is they're taking care of a lot of the blocking and tackling. But when there's an issue that rises, then that's when, the client gets involved, and, we all talk through it. We've done a lot of audits where we're mostly interfacing with the MSP, and but that's more because we're trying to get through there's some grunt work with the audit. We get through a lot of that first to alleviate kind of the bigger issues, this more strategic type questions and issues that come up around scoping. What's the product intended to do? What's the risk? Those judgment type calls that should be left up always to the client at the end of the day, because that's not really the MSP's role to act in a management position. So I think in short, yes, you can have a more direct relationship depending upon the role, but never really acting on behalf of management. That's where you kind of how much can you really do that as a third party?
Yeah. And it can be more of an informal relationship too. I think
Yeah.
just having a network as an MSP of audit partners that you're connected with, and vice versa. And Vanta being in the middle as this platform where we've got customers using both our MSP partners and our audit partners together. I'm in a unique position where I'm seeing this, and I'm like, oh man, we need to connect our MSPs and our auditors together in more of an informal way. But so that, if an MSP is working for a customer that decides they're ready for a PCI audit, they have some known quantities in the QSA world they can reach out to and kind of start that process themselves without needing to come through us, or just sort of a direct line. That's part of it too, I think, from my standpoint.
No, well said. We've got a whole list of trusted parties that we know are going to follow suit with a lot of these things we talked about today, both on as the auditor perspective as well as when we're on the vCISO side.
Yeah, from the informal perspective, like I completely agree with that. I think I was thinking about it, and I think about it more like the CPA perspective. Like I pay a CPA to do my taxes, they stamp that tax return, and they're on the hook if I get audited, right? That's where I'm like, that gets really tricky for an MSP. Informally, absolutely, there's a ton of value in working closely with an audit firm to understand their approach, the types of evidence they like to collect, how they collect things, how they work through the audits. There's a ton of value there.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great way to conclude our call for today. Thank you everyone for attending, and to our experts for sharing your years of experience, insight, being transparent. Please watch your inbox for the email with the recording and some ways to connect with both Electric, Vanta, and BARR following this call. So we hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.